The news marathon continues here on the Freedom TV channel. Natalia Osobit is in the studio. In this hour, we will discuss the following. All money for the war. The Kremlin miscalculated. Bets on oligarchs won't save the Russian economy. Problems are mounting. The Middle East situation, Ukraine's defense contracts with new countries, pressure on Russia and the path to peace. We'll analyze the main events with Mikhailo Podolyak. Forced labor and minimal income. In Russia, they're proposing a 12-hour workday, 6 days a week. Supposedly, it's the only way to save the economy from sanctions. The Kremlin's desire to find funding for the war against Ukraine at any cost leads to a huge budget deficit and ruins the lives of ordinary Russians. My colleagues will continue with this topic.
The plan to recruit contract soldiers for the war against Ukraine is on the verge of failure in Russia. This year, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation expected to attract 409,000 people. That is approximately 35,000 every month. However, the actual pace of Russian mobilization is significantly lower.
Instead of the expected 1,100 to 1,150 contracts per day, over 3 months of 2026, the average daily number of those signing contracts was just over 940. At the same time, it must be remembered that the number of signed contracts does not equal the number of arrivals at the unit. Roughly speaking, if the trend continues, Russia may fall short by 16% or more than 65,000 people. From an article by the UDF publication.
Meanwhile, the Russian army's losses at the front remain high. In March alone, Russia lost about 35,000 military personnel. The rate of personnel replacement no longer covers the level of losses, which creates additional pressure on the recruitment system. At the same time, the armed forces of Ukraine are setting new, even higher targets for eliminating occupiers per month.
More than 35,000 occupiers were removed from the battlefield. What does this mean? It means the defense forces are gaining the capability to perform the task that was defined and conveyed to the troops, namely to approach the mark of 50,000 destroyed occupiers on the line of contact per month. If we destroy more than they put into service monthly, and we have destroyed more, then as a result, their plans and actions for implementation become impossible because there is no one to actively move forward.
Due to the shortage of people, the Kremlin is forced to use the so-called special contingent, that is, convicted persons under investigation or on trial. Thus, Russia is actively applying the amendments to the criminal code adopted in 2024, which allow for the conditional or full release of defendants and convicts from punishment if they signed a contract with the Ministry of Defense, were decorated or were discharged from military service after being wounded.
At least 263 Russians were sentenced to suspended terms or released from colonies on these grounds. Among them are those accused and convicted of drug trafficking, assault, theft, fraud, robbery, drunk driving, corruption, as well as at least 1 convicted of rape, 13 accused of murder, and 11 accused of inflicting grievous bodily harm resulting in death. From an article by the publication Verstka.
In parallel, the Kremlin is increasingly acting through universities. Russian universities are effectively turning into a recruitment tool. As the Moscow Times writes, the country's largest universities were required to send at least 2% of their students to the war. And at the Russian Technological University, amid attempts to drive students into the army, expulsion rules have been sharply tightened. Now, even 1 academic failure can be grounds for expulsion, whereas previously the critical threshold was 5. Previously, students on the verge of expulsion were offered a choice, either lose their place at the university or sign a contract to serve in drone units. Now the Russian Federation is creating this verge of expulsion itself. Thus, the system of recruiting people into the army is moving beyond voluntary and increasingly resembles a covert mobilization, experts note.
The authorities are taking such steps only because they are very afraid of conducting a full mobilization. Well, and accordingly there will surely be some new things invented by the authorities to delay this moment. Well, there isn't a single good outcome, so to speak, and therefore all of this, one way or another, turns against the authorities. And the Russian troops, the Russian command, are making attempts even now at all sorts of meat assaults, yes. when basically people don't matter and they're just thrown almost without weapons into the line of fire. So, of course, they're running out of people.
Another source of personnel replenishment is foreigners. Russia plans to attract at least 18,500 citizens of other countries this year. However, problems arise here as well. A number of states are actively opposing the recruitment of their citizens for the war, which narrows this channel. As a result, the Kremlin is forced to literally gather an army from all possible directions, from prisoners to students and migrants. Maria Jeluchenko for the Freedom TV channel.
We will discuss this topic with our guest. Maxim Blunt, an economic observer and publicist, is joining us now. Hello, Maxim. Yes, good morning. Maxim, I see that the figures aren't really changing much. The budget deficit still remains. And how do you assess how long the, let's say, economy of the Russian Federation can stay afloat, given that 40% of the budget is consumed by the military-industrial complex and the war in general? Could there be some kind of point of no return, to understand where this slide is? Economic slide?
Well, the Russian economy passed the point of no return about 2 years ago, probably, and it's been rolling downhill ever since. As for whether it will hold up or not, it all depends on what you mean by that term. The Russian economy, even according to official statistics, has entered a recession, and the data for the first 2 months of this year show that GDP is declining despite the continued growth of military production. As for the civilian sector of the economy, since the end of 2024, it has been either in stagnation or in recession, with some sectors in depression. And if you look at the production in some civilian sectors, the drop compared to the pre-war level reaches about a third. In some places, 2/3, for example, in the production of household appliances. So it all depends on what you mean by the word collapse or the economy failing. Weapons production remains a priority for the Russian authorities, and the pace of this production is not slowing down. It continues to show growth even in January and February. But this growth no longer compensates for the collapse of civilian sectors. As for the state of the business climate or the expectations of Russians or the quality and standard of living, it's also steadily falling. Moreover, all indicators and business confidence in the future, and all indicators that testify to the state of the business climate, they all say that the economy in Russia is in a recession. And accordingly, the situation is worst in small and medium-sized businesses, where after the tax increase, 95% say it's practically impossible to survive. Well, evidence of the worsening situation, yes. And 45% are thinking about closing their business. 5% have actually stopped operations. So all these factors indicate that the Russian economy is in a crisis. Formally, the authorities don't recognize it yet, but everyone understands perfectly well what's happening. On top of all that, there's this whole internet situation, which first of all affects the quality of life, because the internet, everyone's used to it being like air, right? And they don't even notice it. Well, it's like, it's just there by default. You turn on your phone or your laptop and you already have the internet. And naturally, when it's not there, everyone realizes that it hits business and the banking system even harder. So, I mean, there's various evidence that the Russian economy is not in a very good situation. And this evidence is coming from various sectors. Yes, from the steel makers who have been running to the government since the start of the year with pleas for an immediate bailout, to the banking sector, which also, on the one hand, found itself with a huge number of bad loans, both from businesses and from the population. And on the other hand, it's now also rapidly losing trust, because during the shutdowns, the internet shutdowns, linked to the authorities' attempts to fight VPNs and block Telegram, even basic services don't work, right? You can't pay by card or even sometimes withdraw money at a bank branch. And even that's not possible because the system's frozen, and that's it. People are left without money. So this could, in principle, if it continues, and it most likely will continue, because the authorities have tasked the owners of major internet platforms like Sber or marketplaces, with the goal of starting a fight against VPNs by April 15th and identifying users who access their portals via VPN and consequently restricting traffic for those users. Well, so the internet shutdowns will continue, and this could trigger a run on the banks by depositors. So, I mean, the authorities are adding even more economic problems for themselves, despite the fact that the economy is already, already in a recession, right? And even pro-Kremlin economists from the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis are stating this. But look, again, right, the depth of the crisis doesn't mean that Russia won't be able to produce weapons, for example, right, or won't be able to fight. I'll remind you that
Let's reestablish the connection with Maxim Blunt, and I'll remind you he's an economic observer and publicist. I'd like to touch on the complaints, right, and the inconveniences currently being experienced in the Russian Federation, including those due to communication disruptions. And now, even Russian authorities are increasingly and publicly admitting that the war unleashed against Ukraine has become a strategic trap for the Kremlin. For example, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, complained about the difficulties, saying that Russia is fighting an exhausting battle on 3 fronts simultaneously: military, economic, and informational. Zakharova didn't specify who Moscow is fighting, though. And it's worth noting that each of these so-called fronts mentioned by Zakharova emerged as a direct consequence of the Kremlin's own actions. After all, there are colossal losses on the battlefield and international sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation because of its aggression. Furthermore, the Kremlin has finally lost the battle for the global audience and found itself in a vacuum of its own fakes and propaganda.